Good afternoon, students. So this time we're going to talk about Star Trek and science fiction. And so what has that got to do with your studies? Well, when we study science fiction or when we read any kind of literature, we are engaging in learning about different perspectives of different ways of thinking, different ways of our imagination. And when we read science fiction, it's called speculative fiction, where we speculate what will everything be like in the future. And so when we read science fiction, not just American science fiction, but science fiction from around the world, we get to learn perspectives from different perspectives of people from around the world. We get to learn different cultures, different ways of looking at things, different ways of thinking, and it keeps us from falling into the danger of the single story. And so the more we open our minds to different possibilities, different cultures, the more we are empathic and the more we are able to understand the people around us. So I'm going to share my screen and I'm going to go over some of the advantages of having an open outlook. And I'm going to do this by comparing American science fiction with Chinese science fiction. So I'm going to compare Star Trek versus the three-body problem. And I want to say that there's no one culture is better than another. Instead, I want to emphasize that nobody is better than anybody else. It's simply that we are all different and we should all embrace our differences, and that everybody should work together, just like the crew of this starship, where everybody works together. It doesn't matter what your race is, and everyone works together for a common goal. And so let me share my screen so I can show you what I mean. So one of the great things about science fiction is that it can transport us to different worlds and times, allowing us to see things from a completely different point of view. This is particularly important because different countries and cultures have their own unique stories and ways of looking at the world. By reading science fiction from different cultures, we begin to understand the perspectives of people who are very different from us. But it's not just about understanding different perspectives. Reading diverse perspectives can also help us develop empathy. When we read about characters who are different from us, we begin to see the world through their eyes, and we start to understand their struggles and their triumphs. This can help us become a more empathetic people, and it can help us relate to people who are different from us in our daily lives. Another great thing about science fiction is that it allows us to explore different story structures and values of what is a hero. In some cultures, the hero is the strong silent type who takes action without hesitation. In other cultures, the hero might be a person who uses their intelligence and cunning to outwit their opponents. By reading science fiction from different cultures, we can see how these different values and structures play out in different ways. In short, science fiction is an incredibly powerful tool for learning about different perspectives and developing empathy. By reading science fiction from different cultures, we expand our minds and become more open to the world around us. So I encourage you all to embrace the power of science fiction. For the way different countries and cultures view the relationship between the individual and the group can have a significant impact on the themes and motives that appear in science fiction literature. In cultures where the group is more important than the individual, science fiction stories may focus more on the collective good rather than individual triumphs. For example, in some cultures, the hero sacrifices their own happiness or even their own life for the greater good of the community. On the other hand, cultures where the individual is more important than the group, science fiction stories may focus more on the triumphs of individual characters. For example, in Western culture, the hero is often an individual who overcomes obstacles and achieves their own personal goals rather than sacrificing themselves for the greater good of the community. In Star Trek, the heroes are often members of the Starfleet crew who work together to achieve a common goal. While the crew members have their own individual goals and strengths and goals, they also understand the importance of working together to achieve the greater good. The crew is frequently faced with moral dilemmas that require them to balance their individual interests with the interests of the group. For example, in the episode The Needs of the Many, the character Spock sacrifices himself to save the crew of the Enterprise, illustrating the idea that the needs of the many outweigh the needs of the few. So Spock represented the Asian view of the individual sacrificing himself for the good of the many. It was common in Western science fiction to use Asian values as examples of alien culture, but that is a topic of another video. Similar to how Spock sacrificed himself for the good of the many, the three-body problem, written by Chinese author Liu Cixin, takes a similar approach as Spock, in which the individual is less important than the group. In Chinese culture, the idea of sacrificing the individual for the greater good is very prominent. In the novel, The Three-Body Problem, the characters are faced with a threat that could potentially destroy all of humanity, and all of Earth must work together to prevent this catastrophe. In other words, in about 450 years, aliens will invade Earth. So all of Earth has to work together to ward off that invasion. And so in the three-body problem, each of the main characters sacrifice their individual happiness in order to try to solve the problem of how to ward off and defeat the Trisolarians. That's the name of the aliens who want to invade Earth and destroy humanity. And so in the Three-Body Problem, which is a Chinese science fiction novel, the individual is not important. It's the interests of the group that's important. And so in this novel, it's about trying to save humanity. And so each character is willing to sacrifice himself or herself in order to save humanity. And all of humanity on Earth work together. All the different governments all work together to try to find a solution, to find a way to defeat the common enemy, which is the Trisolarians. And so here in Chinese science fiction, therefore the interests of the group outweigh the interests of the individual. So overall, while both Star Trek and the Three-Body Problem deal with the individual versus the group dynamic, they do so in different ways that reflect the cultural values of their creators. Star Trek emphasizes the importance of balancing individual interests with the interests of the group, while the Three-Body Problem explores the dangers of sacrificing individual freedom for the greater good. By reading science fiction works from different cultures, we can gain insight into different perspectives on the individual versus group dynamic and expand our understanding of cultural values. By reading science fiction from different cultures, we can gain a better understanding of how different societies view the individual or the group. These works can challenge our assumptions and help us develop empathy for people with different perspectives and values. Additionally, science fiction can provide a safe space to explore difficult social and political issues and can serve as a political tool for sparking conversation and promoting change. In Star Trek: The Next Generation, there is an episode called I, Borg, in which the crew encounters a lone Borg drone. So basically in Star Trek, the Borg is the ultimate enemy of Star Trek. Basically the Borg assimilates all other alien species and turns the individual into a robot. And so one of the greatest fears in Star Trek is for the individual to lose all individuality. And so Borg, that's why the Borg, in which they assimilate everything and only do groupthink, represents the biggest fear and danger to the Federation. And so the Borg, usually the Queen Borg, she's the one who makes all of the decisions. And so all the individual Borg are programmed to follow her orders. And so in this particular episode in The Next Generation called I, Borg, one of the Borg's spaceships becomes stranded and far away from the Queen. And so they encounter a lone Borg drone, a member of a collective alien species that assimilates other species into their group mind. The crew debates whether to use the drone as a weapon against the Borg or to try to rehabilitate it as an individual. The episode ultimately emphasizes the importance of seeing the Borg as individuals rather simply as a mindless collective. So therefore, in Star Trek, in Western science fiction, especially in American science fiction, the individual is the most important, because in American culture, every individual has the right to their own happiness. And so in American literature, the hero is always an individual who has to struggle in order to develop his own identity by taking initiative, either against the orders of his family or against establishment. And so by emphasizing their individuality and their initiative, that's how you have an American hero. However, in Chinese culture and in Chinese literature and science fiction, it's the other way around. The hero in a Chinese story, not just science fiction, is that you forget about your individuality and that you sacrifice your individuality and happiness for the good of the group. And so therefore, in the Three-Body Solution by Liu Cixin, the main antagonist, Yi Wen-ji, believes that humanity is doomed to destroy itself, and that the only solution is to work with an alien race called the Trisolarians to save the species. Yi is willing to sacrifice her individual freedom and even lives in order to achieve this goal, leading to conflict with the protagonist, Wang Miao, who believes in the value of individual autonomy. And so that would be the American view, because, and then what's interesting about the three-body problem, both the United States and China have adapted a TV version to the book, The Three-Body Problem. And so in the American version of the TV adaptation, Yi Wen-jie, the main character, she was the one who initiated first contact. And so in the American version, there's more emphasis on the individual. And so in the American version of the three-body solution, three-body problem, Yi Wen-jie, the reason why she contacted the aliens is not for the good of not for the good of the many or the good of the collective. It's because she wants revenge because of all the bad pain she suffered in her life. And so therefore, in revenge against all the pain she suffered, in revenge for that, that's why she made contact with the aliens, knowing that the aliens would come and destroy humanity. And so in the American version, Ye Wen-jie's goal is very selfish and very individual, very focused on the individual. So that's how they did it in the American version. And then in the Chinese version, they said they had her, they have her as she sacrificed her freedom in order to make a better society. Her hope was that if she had contacted the aliens would come over and remodel remodel human society into a more advanced, better society. And so, and so in the Chinese version of the TV of the same novel, the focus is more on what's good for the collective, what's good for the group, what's good for humanity. And so she's trying to save humanity by contacting the aliens and hoping that the aliens could come and rehabilitate us. And therefore, it's the good of the collective. Whereas in the American version, it's some kind of selfishness, of revenge of the individual. So even when they adapt the same book, even when people Americans and Chinese people all adapt this very same book, they do it from a different point of view. For the Americans, what's important is the motivations of the individual. And then for what's good with the Chinese version was that it's what's good for the collective, individual versus collective. And so that's why it's fun to read science fiction from all around the world, because you learn different perspectives. So I'm not saying that Americans or Chinese or whatnot are better than each other, that any culture is better than each other. I want to embrace our differences and embrace how different we are. And when we read books from other cultures, we explore these different perspectives. We develop a more diverse perspective, and we get to, it enlarges our imagination. And also in Star Trek, the Deep Space Nine, there is an episode called In the Pale Moonlight, in which the captain of the space station, Benjamin Sisko, makes a morally questionable decision to deceive an alien race in order to get them to join the war effort against a common enemy. Yeah, I remember that. I remember watching that episode. Basically, what they did was, on this planet, they manufactured a they manufactured a monster. In other words, they did it. I think they did it through holographs, and then they tricked the people of this planet into thinking that a monster was attacking their planet. And in order for the people, and then the people had to all gather together and in order to fight the monster. If the monster was ever defeated, then the people would go right back to arguing among themselves, and the whole planet would all split up. So Captain Sisko decided that they should maintain the monster by keeping the hologram there, so that the planet would always be under alert and keep thinking that a monster is about to attack them. And as long as the planet thought a monster is about to attack them, then they would fight against that common enemy and not fight among themselves. Thus, when they fight to defeat a common enemy, then they're able to stay united. And believe it or not, stay at peace. Because then if you're not fighting against each other, then you have peace. So then Sisko struggles with the tension between his duties as a Starfleet officer not to interfere in other civilizations versus what's good for the collective. And so in the end, he chooses his own individual path. And he thinks that, and he's the one, Sisko, decides what's good for the collective without even asking the collective what's good for them. So so in Star Trek, it's very American. It's all about the individual. It's all about all people who's diverse come together to work together, and on an equal basis. So that's all very American. And so that's what's fun about science fiction, is that each of the science fiction stories that you read represent the values, the cultural values of the country that wrote it. And so basically, United States and China are not the only countries that has written science fiction. I only use those two just for the simplicity of this presentation. There's, many countries, Africa, many areas of the world, like Africa, Europe, South America, Australia, Southeast Asia, all areas of the world have their own kind of science fiction reflecting their values. For example, in Calcutta Chromosome, I believe that's the name of it, Southeast Asia, for instance, reincarnation becomes a main topic in their science fiction. In African science fiction, it's the relationship between the individual and the family, and also all of your energy comes from the earth. It comes, and so there's a very big relationship between the individual, family, and then the elders and people who came from the past. And so a lot of the stories are more organic, more about the family, more about tradition in African science fiction. And a good example of African science fiction is found in Binti by Nnedi Oforator. Okay, I will focus on the difference between American science fiction and African science fiction in a different video. So what I'm going to do in the future is I will create a bunch of videos in which I will compare American science fiction with other countries. And the only reason why I'm doing it that way is to make it easier for American students to understand the diverse perspectives by starting out with something that American students are already familiar with and then branching out from what American students are already familiar with to something different, since these videos are geared for my American students in the 2 colleges that I'm currently teaching at. And so I want my students of both schools to embrace what's different, to read a lot and read books, not just from your own country or your own culture, but to go outside of your culture and read books from other cultures that you're not familiar with. And this will strengthen your perspective of the world. This will help you broaden your horizon and understanding of the people around you. So that, let's say you walk down the street and you see a Chinese restaurant or a Thai restaurant or a French restaurant, and then the people in that restaurant behave differently than your own family. And so by not just reading science fiction, but any kind of literature that's outside your culture, then you understand that culture, because when you read literature, you develop an empathy for that main character. You see the world through the eyes of that character. And so that's why it's important to read books from other cultures, not just science fiction. Science fiction just happens to be something I like to read. So that's basically it. So overall, these examples illustrate how Star Trek and the 3-body problem approached the individual versus group dynamic in different ways. Star Trek emphasizes the importance of balancing individual interests with the interests of the group, while also recognizing the value of individual autonomy and identity. The 3-body problem, on the other hand, explores the, I already said this, but it's worth repeating. So the 3-body problem explores the dangers of sacrificing individual freedom for the greater good and the tension between individual and collective identities. By examining these works in depth, we can gain a greater appreciation for the different ways in which science fiction can help us understand and navigate complex social and ethical issues. In Star Trek, individual characters often have their own personal goals and motivations, but they also understand the importance of working together toward a common goal. And so the crew of the Enterprise is a diverse group of individuals with different backgrounds and experiences, but they are united by their dedication to the Starfleet mission and the protection of the Federation. This balance between individualism and collectivism reflects the cultural values of the United States, where the importance of individual rights and freedom is tempered by a sense of responsibility to the wider community. In the 3-body problem, the individual versus the group dynamic is explored in a different way. The novel is set in China during the Cultural Revolution, a time when individual freedoms were heavily restricted in the name of the greater good. The protagonist, Yi Wen-jie, is a scientist who believes that the only way to save humanity is to abandon individual freedoms and submit to the aliens. The novel raises important questions about the balance between individual freedom and collective security, and explores the consequences of sacrificing individuality for the sake of the aliens, or for the sake of the group. So through the lens of science fiction, readers can gain insight into different cultural values and perspectives on the individual versus group dynamic. Star Trek and the 3-body solution offer contrasting views on this issue, reflecting the different cultural contexts in which they were created. By reading and analyzing these works, students can develop a deep understanding of the complexities of culture and society and learn to approach different cultural differences with empathy and an open mind. That should be the end of this file. Yeah. So basically, Star Trek then represents, American values. So like in this background, you have a whole bunch of people of different nationalities all working together with the common goal of upholding the values of the Federation and also protecting the Federation against hostile enemies such as the Borg, because the Borg would then rip apart this diversity in which everybody becomes the same. So for American science fiction, the greatest fear is losing that diversity, losing that individuality. And then in the three-body solution, it's all about what's good for the collective. And so you have all of Earth, all the governments of Earth, all working together, trying to solve the problem of how to get rid of the aliens, how to eliminate the aliens before they eliminate us. And that the main character sacrificed herself in order to save humanity from its sins. And each of the characters all sacrifice their individual freedom. So that I only did Ye Wenjie, but also Li Guo. Also, he's a physicist, and he fell in love with his wife, had a kid, and then he had to give all of that up in order to. They put his family in frozen, and then they would only unfreeze his family is only if he solved the problem of getting rid of the aliens. And in the end, I think he did. He managed to ward off the aliens for a long period of time, and then in the last few years of his life, he finally got to be with his wife. But so that's an example of someone sacrificing their personal life for the good of of many, just like Spock when he sacrificed himself for the good of the Enterprise. And so, and of course, in Star Trek, only one character would do that. Not all the other characters would not, because it's more about the individual. Whereas in Three-Body Problem, it's more about. So either way, okay, it's fun to look at the different perspectives, the different points of view from which a story is written. Also, the story structure is different in the West, in the West and in the East. In the West, the story structure, you have a triggering event, then you have some kind of suspense, you have climax, and you have some kind of resolution. So that is the story structure within and it's character driven and driven by the wants and needs of the individual and the hero that's going on this quest. And in Chinese story structure, you have more of the climax or the main event is buried in the middle of the story. And first you have a context of what happened and the results. So it's usually backwards. And so basically it's a different story structure. So in let's take a look at how the Three-Body Problem was adapted. In America, they started with the very first scene. They started with Ye Wenjie presses that button, and then those aliens are now coming in 450 years. So that was the triggering event. At the very beginning, she presses that button, which triggers everything else that happens. So you have triggering event. Climax would be when the aliens come and everyone does battle, and how you do battle with the aliens or whatever. And then a resolution, which is 3 novels. Right now they're still in the first, all the productions are still doing season 1, and now they're doing season 2. So no one has gotten to season 3, which has the ending. Anyway, and then in the Chinese version, they don't start out with the triggering event. Instead, they build on the context. And so instead, they start out with, as a mystery, a whole bunch of scientists are all killing themselves. All around the world, scientists are killing themselves. And then nobody knows why. And so the police or the main character has to figure out why or what's causing it, what's the root of the problem. And therefore, you don't find out until midway that it has something to do with aliens. Almost towards the very end of season 1, do you find out that it had something to do with aliens. So, in the Chinese version, you give context first. and then you have the solution, almost like a mystery, okay? Whereas in the American version of the same three-body problem, it starts out with triggering event, and then you have your climax, and then you have your, so not only it's character driven, so not only the individual versus the group, the story structure is also different when you read stories from outside your culture. So I love to read science fiction, and I've always been a Trekkie, and I remember going to the conventions, and I met, William Shatner, I met Leonard Nimoy. I didn't get to meet the Doctor because he'd already passed away, nor did I get to meet Scotty. He'd already passed away too, but I got to meet Nichelle Nichols, and who else? George Takei, and William Shatner, and Leonard Nimoy of the original crew. And I think I also got to meet Marina Sirtis. She's from The Next Generation. So it was a lot of fun, and I really love Star Trek because of its values of bringing everyone together around diversity, and all the diversity working together with the common goal of defending the Federation. So in my next video, I will also talk about how American science fiction fares against other, like African science fiction, or Middle East science fiction, South America science fiction, and so on and so forth. And I want to encourage all of my students to keep on reading, because the more you read, the better you write. So this goes for my English 101 classes, in which I just teach writing. I always encourage my students to read more. And if you read science fiction or any other kind of novel, you expand your vocabulary exponentially. So it's not just science fiction. If you don't like science fiction, you can read westerns, romance, any kind of literature you want. So I hope that this is a great introduction and foray into literature, writing, and into learning about diversity, and about learning about different perspectives as we read novels outside of Western novels. And so if you have any questions, you can always email me.